Good afternoon, all. This week's Parsha is Parshat Emor. I've entitled it, Leadership is Hard. For those of you for whom some of this may sound a little bit familiar, some years ago, I believe 2016, I gave a lot of this particular Devar Torah that I'm about to share with the group that I was together with. It may have been at a national retreat, it might have been in our home, at our partnership minyan, I don't recall. But I just felt in looking at resources that it was an important reminder for us in this time in which we live, where, as a lot of people say, the job of elected officials is to get reelected. And that has just led to some horrible examples of leadership, I believe. That's a nice statement. And to our dystopian situation in which we all seem to be living. So I'm going to start with a joke. Most of us probably know this already, but it teaches a valuable lesson. A guy approaches a rabbi and explains that he wants to become a Kohen. He offers to donate money. And the rabbi says, I'm sorry. He comes back. He offers to donate more money. Rabbi says, I'm sorry. And this goes on and on and on, till the man who is wealthy pledges an amount that just makes the rabbi's eyeballs pop out. And he says, okay, it's good for the community, it's good for the kehila, fine, you can be a Kohen. So the guy is just so happy and he's thrilled and he's just beyond joyful. And the rabbi says to him, so tell me something, why do you want to be a Kohen so much? And now those of you that know the joke can say the punchline in unison with me. The gentleman replies, my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen, my great-grandfather was a Kohen. We learn that there are things that money cannot buy. We know this in our hearts, we know this in our minds, but it does not mean that people do not try and then get away with it, as we see too often in our very difficult times. When we look at the unit of these three Parshiot that we have gone through, Acharei Mot, that begins with Nadav and Avihu and what they did, and Aharon being quiet, and the various practices of the Mitzrayim that the Jews are not to continue, and then Kedoshim with the practices that we are to continue as an Am HaKadosh, which we spoke about last week, and then chapter 20, again repeating the Kohanim are doing these things that are casual behaviors and they're not intentional and they're not for the good of the people and they should not be engaged in. And now we come to the leadership. We come after these practices to avoid from other people and the code given to the Bnei Yisrael. We now come to the leadership. So let's peek for a moment into the life of a Kohen and see what we're dealing with. Vayomer Hashem Moshe Emor el Kohanim b'nei Aharon v'amarta alehem lenefesh lo yitamei ba'amar. And the Lord said to Moshe, speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and said to them, none of you shall defile yourself, shall make yourself tamei in the population. And we know that this is one of the first restrictions on a Kohen, in terms of not going to a funeral, not being in contact with a corpse. There are special walkways, there are special locations in funeral homes for Kohanim, but they are never to be exposed to Tumat Hamet, the uncleanliness or the impurity, not uncleanliness, impurity of a dead person, except for a parent, a child, a spouse, an unmarried sister. Those are the only exceptions. A husband cannot lo yitamei ba'al ba'amo lehechalo for a wife under certain circumstances, and they are spelled out in various codes. I am presently learning Hilchot Sha'ar Tumat avotatumot, the halachot of the first degree of impurities through Rambam. And again, this just comes to be an impossible standard to maintain. No bald patches on their heads. They do not shave the edge of their beard. They do not make cuts in their flesh. Kedoshim yiyu le'elokechem v'lo yuchalalu Hashem elokechem ki et ishei Hashem lechem elokechem hem mekrevim v'hayu kodesh. And even here, remembering what we talked about last week, the word kadosh here is still written in kativ maleh. It's written in without the vav. They shall be as holy as they possibly can to God. They will not desecrate God's name because they offer up the fire offerings, the food offering of God. They shall not marry a woman who is a prostitute, who is desecrated in any way. They shall not marry a woman who is divorced. Ki kadoshu le'elokav, because this Kohen is kadosh to God. You will sanctify him because he offers up the food offering. He will be holy to you. I, the Lord your God, who sanctifies you, am holy. And here again we say kadosh for the Kohen without the vav, with God, ki kadosh ani Hashem mekadshem, with the vav. That's consistent. And it goes on, if a Kohen's daughter somehow becomes desecrated, and she desecrates her father, she shall be burned in the fire. And the Kohen who is elevated above his brothers, he shall not leave his hair uncut or cut his garments. And it goes on and on and on about the high priest, the Kohen HaGadol, that's the section we're in now, and the additional restrictions on them. The Kohen HaGadol must marry a woman who is a virgin, cannot marry a widow, cannot marry a divorcee. All of these restrictions are very, very clear on the Kohen. And one of the things that we have to understand is they're here because the leader is in a different position, being the representative of God, representing the idea of kadosh as much as possible as a human being can, and therefore is required to observe these different restrictions. Remember the restrictions on the malachim, which we will actually come to later in the cycle, but I've spoken about in the past, in Devarim and Shoftim, where we're told, yes, you will have a melech, but he should not have too many horses, he should not have too many wives, he should not have too many belongings, he should not forget his humility, because then he will lose his position as head of this people, the Bnei Israel. And this is a problem. This is the problem where our leaders end up thinking that leadership is permission to do what they want, whereas what we are saying here is required, it's a responsibility to do as they are told. And then we read further about the Kohanim. Kol ish asher bo mum, lo yigraf ish iver, lo piseach, cherem, o sharua, goes on and on. Any man who has a defect shall not approach, cannot be a Kohen, no blind, not someone who is lame, not one who has a sunken nose, mismatching limbs, an eye above another eye, a broken leg, a broken arm, long eyebrows, a cataract, dry lesions, or any of this. All of these things disqualify the Kohanim. Any man, kol ish, asher bomu mizera yaharon, any person from Aaron's seed who has any of these blemishes, lo yigash lahakriv et asher Hashem, will not come to draw up God's offerings. If there's a defect in him, he cannot come to offer God's offerings. So the question, and I may have mentioned this earlier in one of the other Parshiot, but I think it bears repeating, that I posed to my Rav, to Rabbi Eliezer Hirsch, he should live and be well, is as I'm studying Rambam's Mishnah Torah and all of these mumim and defects and requirements and sources of impurity and all that, the question is, was there ever a Kohen that really met all the requirements? Was there ever a Korban that really met all of the requirements? And the second thing I want to add from more recent learning is that it's not a matter of cleanliness as we think about it in our lives. So, as an example, In Rambam, in the text that I've been learning, Parak Tet, chapter 9 of the additional sources of impurities, it makes it very clear that if a man is standing, if someone is standing, and water pours on their head, and it is not from a drawn source, but it is from a variety of different kelim, of different containers, or it came down from the trees, after whatever it is, they cannot wash themselves and then say, I am tahor. Liquid of any type conveys first degree tum'ah, impurity. So you can't wash your hands in soap, if you will, and then say, I am pure, I can go to the temple. They have to immerse in a mikvah. And here you get a very clear delineation from Rambam in the 11th to 12th centuries that is teaching us cleanliness is not the same as purity. Purity is a notch above, it's different. It has a whole different set of criteria that are connected to it. So all of this is to say, we are setting standards that leaders are to be aware of, but we may not be able to attain. This connected to me or made a very interesting personal impact on me because my amazing husband, Ken, with whom we've just celebrated our 30th anniversary, I said to him one time, Ken, what would have happened if you were a Kohen? Because I had been divorced. And we just didn't even want to think about it. And I was sharing this story with some friends at a conference that I go to annually. And somebody said, I have to say something. So this person gets up, it's a group of Orthodox Jews, and he says, I have to tell you a story. My grandparents met at such and such a time, so this is going back 3 generations. He's a contemporary of mine, this gentleman. And my grandmother had been a divorced woman. And my grandfather is a Kohen. And my father's a Kohen, and I'm a Kohen. He knew the joke. And they went to a Rav. And she was a very young woman. It was a very sad story. And the Rav gave them a heter to get married. I am not going to say that when we are given standards in halacha, they are not meant to be observed. What I am going to say is that the more I have learned, the more I realize there are instances where accommodations can be and are made. For example, the Kohen himself. No physical blemishes, limbs have to be the same length, cannot have a club foot, cannot have visual, all these things that are just part of our human equation. However, all of this was physical. That was to parallel the korbanot. And the most interesting part of all of this to me is that if the Kohen was limited in his ability to learn, people could help him through the various services that he performed. And I thought, how interesting. How interesting. And if you think about it, a leader, a good leader, does have limitations. They have limitations in terms of to what degree their private life may be their private life. They cannot engage in behaviors. We all know that Marat Ayin dynamic. So all of these things are part of our structure. And it may seem like it's too much. But consider this. Years ago, I watched a movie that made an incredible impression on me. And I've actually tried to locate it to watch it again. I've not been successful in doing so. But it was called The Brides of Christ. And it was about novices who take their vows to be nuns. I was struck by the insularity of their position in life as compared to the public persona of Kohanim. Kohanim are always engaging with the population. They're dealing with folks with tzara. They're dealing with all kinds of religious questions. They're taking the offerings. They're helping people make the offerings. They're doing all of these things. They are not monks. They are not nuns. They are not priests who eschew public involvement. In this movie, the novices are basically saying goodbye to their families. They're saying goodbye to anything they knew as any kind of normal life. And they are committing themselves to live in the insularity, in the isolation of the convent. Very, very different. Very different. Another example of accommodation. There's another movie, Eshet Cohen. I also recommend you watch that, which tells the story of the wife of a Kohen who opens the door to give tzedakah. And the frum guy, dressed appropriately, who's not supposed to come into the house because of yichud, you're not supposed to be alone with a married woman. She goes and she gets her tzedakah, and she goes to the door and gives it to him. Pushes the door open, comes in the house, and rapes her. The woman's wife is a Kohen. The woman's husband is a Kohen. She goes to a Beit Din, and a lot of the movie is the Beit Din going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Do they allow this woman to still be with her husband after this rape? Because she has been made impure, if you will. In the end, the Beit Din claims that there were no witnesses. And this is an important part of Jewish law, that we think that there are so many things that people can be called on, but witnesses are critically important. There has to be 2 witnesses that are there, that have seen it, that have witnessed the whole thing, brought them to the Beit Din. There can't be any interruption or corruption of the line of being a witness. And in the end, the Beit Din claims, you know what? There were no witnesses. We don't know that it happened. She should get whatever guidance she can get, and they should stay married. Rashi repeats in this explanation of the Kohen and these various restrictions, al kircho, that some of these things may be against the will of the Kohen. But how much of the restrictions for this holiness of the station of the Kohen are counterintuitive to being a person who lives in a community, to not be able to go to a funeral, or to not be able to mourn with the community when something terrible happens, or to be able to have any type of normative life. There are many reasons for these restrictions on Kohanim. And again, while there's adaptation mechanisms, let's look at the restrictions for a moment. Number 1, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We know this. We have seen this. We are living in this reality. Secondly, for the Kohanim, every aspect of power is countered by a restriction that reminds them that they are subservient to God, cannot co-opt power for themselves, as did Nadav and Avihu. Aharon himself understood this when told about the death of his sons, as we note in his reaction to their death. Domem, he was quiet. And thirdly, we have a great example of when these restrictions are not in place in the story and the generations of our kings during the Malchut Yisrael. They did not observe all these restrictions, and look what happened. This focus on the restrictions and the hardships of leadership is validated in our Haftara from Yechezkel, chapter 44, in which we read in almost parallel formation. V'konim haleviim b'nei tzadok hayu shamru et mishmeret mikdashei b'nei Yisrael ma'ala hama yakrivu elai l'sharteni v'amdu lifnai v'hakriv lo chele v'dam na'um Hashem adokim. The priests, the Levites, the Kohanim, the Levites, the sons of Tzadok, who kept the charge of my sanctuary. This is Yechezkel speaking. When the children of Israel went astray from me, they should come near to me, they should minister to me, they should stand before me, they should make their offerings. So clearly, did they focus on their tasks and observe the level of Kedusha to which they were assigned, this level is above and beyond what was indicated in the previous Parshat Kedoshim. And it's democratization of Kedusha. While there's democratization of Kedusha for the Amcha, the Kohanim are still to function on a different level. You don't have to go further than consideration of how we are shell-shocked and horrified when abuses come out of some of our rabbis, our leaders, priests, people that take their office and hide behind the cloak of their authority and do horrible things. We know this happens in our world. Back to Yechezkel. They shall enter my sanctuary, they shall approach my table, and they shall keep my charge. It goes on and it talks about how they go out to the outer court. When they leave that private place where they give the offerings, they go to the outer court, verse 19. They shall take off their garments where they minister and place them in the chambers belonging to the sanctuary and clothe themselves with other garments. And they shall not, in other words, again, come in contact with people who are part of the real world with their sanctified garments. It's kind of like, again, this is not cleanliness or purity. The same. Purity is here. Cleanliness is something else. It's similar to what I stated earlier, where going and taking a shower or what have you is not the same as immersing in a mikvah. And that is made very clear. And again, Yechezkel continues to repeat. The hair of their heads they should not shave. They must let it grow wild. It goes on. No priest can drink anything when they come into an inner court. They cannot take certain people for their wives. And to my people, and this is probably the most critical verse, Ve'etami yeru ben kodesh l'cho uvein tamei l'hatahor yodim. They shall teach, and I'm going to add the words here, by example, the difference between holy and profane or daily, and calls them to discern between the impure and the pure. Only then, says Yechezkel, may they stand in judgment according to my ordinances, God's, and decide my teachings and statutes, and serve the people. They shall not come into contact with any human corpse, is repeated yet again. And once they purify themselves, this is immersion in a mikvah, they must count 7 days, and on that day they may come into the sanctuary. In other words, it's acknowledging that they are not to subject themselves to any impurities, but they will because they are human beings. They are not nuns in a convent or priests in a seminary or holy people in an ashram. They are living amongst the people. So they're going to come into contact with these things. So they must go through all of these aspects of purifying themselves in order to come back and do the offerings and proceed to serve in the temple. Here is the takeaway from me, and I hope for others in all of these details that swim in our heads. Leadership is intentionally hard. And there are very important lessons regarding the limitations and restrictions on the life of a Kohen, who must balance their position in the community with their ongoing and continual service to God, unlike others who live cloistered lives. One could argue, and many do, that this is no longer relevant and therefore should be discontinued. However, as difficult and counterintuitive as some of these restrictions may and do feel, I think that there are very important lessons here about leadership and the value of remembering that this is not about power, absolute power, not even for, and especially not for the Kohen HaGadol, much less the Kohanim. Maybe for the Kohanim, given their office, given what they do, the light can be too bright. In other words, it can be overwhelming. And these limitations are there to remind them of the limits of their humanity so that they will use their leadership responsibly, unlike the kings that come later in our history and our prophets bemoan. As for today, personally, I thank God every day that my husband Ken is not a Kohen and we didn't have to deal with this. Shabbat Shalom, be well, have a great week all. Lihitraot.